Hey, welcome back to another video and Happy New Year to you. So today I'm going to be talking you through the best books that I read in 2021. So this was quite an interesting reading year in the sense of I didn't read as much as I thought I was going to be able to. I lost the first 6 months of the year to academia and then I lost the following months to work. And I just was never able to get into a solid reading habit over the year, which feels kind of weird because I am a reader. So this shouldn't really be difficult to me. But aside from that, it was also weird in the sense of it's the first time in the last 4 years that I didn't personally read anything that I would rate a 5-star read. So that was a bit odd. And I thought maybe this could be looked upon as a bit of a failure within a reading year. But to be honest, this is something that I expect will happen more and more because I'm getting a lot more critical with my reading. My expectations with what good writing is and good storytelling is going up and up with the more I read. And over the last couple of years, when I first started my Goodreads, for example, 10 years ago, I was rating a lot of things 5 stars, and that's really whittled down over the years to maybe 1 or 2 books a year that I would personally think that was a 5-star read. So the fact that there's no 5-star reads doesn't mean that the books that I'm going to be talking about are any less of a masterpiece, but they're just, in comparison to other things that I've read, they just didn't kind of hit that mark for me. But I did read a lot of good stuff. The majority of the books that I read last year, I rated 4 stars. And I think that's down to the fact that I'm still curating what I'm reading and researching books before I start reading them, because that's something that's really important to me because I'm someone who doesn't DNF books. So, I don't want to really be wasting my time by reading drivel. Let's get on to the best books of 2021. So the first book that I want to chat about is The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa. So I had been really anticipating the release of this book. It was originally published in the 90s, but only translated in recent years to English. So this is something that I've just been wanting to read for quite some time. And I finally did it in January of last year. So this is the story of an unnamed narrator who lives in an unnamed island off an unnamed coast. A lot of the time with this kind of anonymous nature of the storytelling, you feel like the main character is kind of purposely kind of keeping you at a distance. And I really enjoyed this book. So basically, on this island, there are a group of people referred to as the Memory Police, and they kind of keep the law and inflict this sort of bizarre memory loss on the citizens of this island. It started out with small things disappearing. There's some people who will just forget things once they're no longer, out of sight, out of mind. But then there's other people who do continue to remember things. And these are the people who are a threat to the Memory Police. Because there's so much that you don't know about the story, you're able to kind of fill in the gaps yourself, and you can take it any which way you want, So the ending for me, at first, I was really I didn't really appreciate it. But the more I sat with this afterwards and the more I thought about it, I thought that was the only way this book was going to end. And I think that's the perfect way to end it. And even though you're left with a whole heap of questions, at least I was, I still thought that overall it was a really great read. I will say that if you are a fan of Ogawa's darker storytelling, you might not be blown away by this, but I would say that if you were really impressed by The Housekeeper and the Professor, then this is probably something that you'll really enjoy. Next is Passing by Nella Larsen. So this is a book that I'd been meaning to read for quite some time, so I'm really happy that 2021 was the year that I finally got it read. And I know a lot of people did end up reading this last year with the announcement of the Netflix film adaptation of it, which I still haven't actually seen, so I'll have to do that at some point over the next while. This is the story of 2 childhood friends who reunite as adults, and it's 2 women, Irene and Claire, and they are both Black women, but more so Claire passes for white within society, and Irene is kind of fascinated by this concept and scared by it, but she's also someone who can pass for white. I'd say that when I read this, I was kind of more fixated on that aspect, on the 1920s attitude towards Black women in society and the fact that it was set in Harlem. I thought like that was a very interesting aspect. And again, it was more so that once time passed after I finished reading it, I started thinking more about this, like the underlying themes of like jealousy and insecurity, motherhood, and all these other things that women in particular have to deal with. So this book has a lot of depth to it despite its short length. But it's definitely one that I recommend anyone read. Again, this is another book that I was really perplexed by the ending. Like, I don't know if I had a good reaction to what happens in the final like act of this book. I don't know if I had a quote unquote normal reaction, because I was just so flabbergasted by it that I just didn't really know what to think of it. And again, like that's the whole point, is that like you're led to make up your own mind about what actually happens. But I think the underlying feelings of like paranoia, I couldn't shake that feeling of like being on edge and like having tense shoulders while I was getting through this. But again, I think this is a really interesting read. I think that like I said, there's a lot more to it than what you may think of the initial story synopsis. And it was also really fascinating, to be perfectly honest. So yeah, I definitely recommend checking this one out. Another book that I read in January. January was actually my best reading month overall. I read like 5 or 6 books, and the majority of them were like 4-star reads. So the next one is The Last Wish by Andrew Sapkowski. So this is the first short story collection in the Witcher series. If you are familiar with the video games or the TV show on Netflix, you'll know what this is about. So Netflix did lift some of the short stories in this. So if you've seen the first season, you'll be familiar enough with what happens in this. Because I watched the show before I read this, that definitely helped me with like understanding what was happening in this, because it does kind of flitter back and forth. And there are these moments in between chapters where it just seems like Geralt, who's the main character, is like recovering from some form of battle, and he's like kind of going in and out of consciousness. I think just without any sort of idea of what this is about, and the fact that it does go back and forth in time, I think it is a little bit perplexing. So you might want to take notes when you're reading it if you're going in without any sort of previous knowledge. But overall, I loved this collection of short stories. I also really enjoyed the follow-up, Sword of Destiny, which is the second short story collection before the main series actually starts. And I think why I was so surprised why I enjoyed this so much is because I was told by many people that the translation into English wasn't great. Personally, I thought it was quite spectacular. I thought that if I didn't know any better, I would have assumed that it was written in English. I really liked the use of language in it. There were certain words that I haven't come across in a really long time that popped up, and I just felt like I was having my brain massaged a little bit now and again, because like I really enjoy reading classics, and I felt like this kind of leaned into using more classical language. So that was like enjoyable. For me, being a freaking nerd. I definitely recommend it if you want something that is a bit of a light read and a fun read as well, because like that's pretty much why I wanted to read it at the time that I did, because I was reading kind of more serious sort of stuff, and I just wanted to immerse myself in a completely fantasy world with monsters and ghouls and all that kind of thing. Next is Beloved by Toni Morrison. So this again is another book that I had been meaning to read for years, so much so that I'm pretty sure it's been on 1 or 2 of my TBRs for certain years that I never got around to reading. This, for some reason, was always a bit of a struggle for me to get my head around, and I think it's just because of the subject matter. Even if it is a work of fiction, it's something that's based in reality, so you can't really shift that. It's about a mother and daughter who have escaped slavery, and a few other characters in the book are also people who escaped, who came from the same plantation. And to me at the time, it really read as like a mother-daughter story. It follows the story of a haunting in this house that they live in, and Setha, who's the mother, believes that they are being haunted by her first daughter who passed away a many number of years ago. She believes that the spirit drives people away from her and her family, and even drives her family away as well. There's so much to think about when reading this book, and again, the latter half of the novel is something that I feel like the imagery is just going to stay in my brain for the rest of my life. It is sometimes referred to as a horror novel. Like, I don't think that's necessarily fair, based on the context of what it's about, but I can understand people's reaction towards it. I have to read things from time to time that are gonna provoke some very serious feelings within myself, and this was just one of those books. So I recommend that everyone reads this at least once in their life. Again, I think there are many different themes in this, and there are many different elements that you may focus on when reading it. And then afterwards, you know, it's one of those books that you really have to think about and digest in order to kind of get the bigger picture. Next is The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick. So I'm a huge fan of Philip K. Dick's writing. I feel like his storytelling knew no bounds, and he's definitely one of my favorite authors. But when I was reading this, I was having such a miserable time with it because I, at the time, thought I wasn't enjoying it. I wasn't really immersed in the plot. I found the characters to be quite dull. And it wasn't until I started talking about this book to people in my life that I could listen to myself talk about it and then realize, like, actually, this book is fantastic. Why am I having such a miserable time reading it? Because it's so entertaining. There's so much going on with it. And it was just weird. It was just one of those kind of odd sort of things where I thought I was really not liking it, and it turns out I loved it. Now, would I say that this is one of my all-time favorite Philip K. Dick books? No, because I think it was quite different in tone from what I had previously read of him. But this story takes place in 1960s America, and it is in the aftermath of World War II. And it's kind of a reimagining that Germany and Japan won World War II. The rest of the world has just been overthrown by Germany, and like the Nazis are in power and all that sort of thing. I think what I was really impressed by this book, though, is just the characters themselves. So you've got people who are Jewish, who are trying to hide within like everyday society. Some go to the extent of like getting plastic surgery as to not be found out. And then there's just like these other characters in it, like this one particular moment that I just thought was just so unbelievably petty, but just the constant threat of being reported. And like, you might not even be a character that's Jewish in this, but you still have to deal with the threat that you may be reported just because someone doesn't like you. And I was just like, oh my God. I mean, maybe that's not what I should be taking away from this, but overall, I found this to be, once I kind of let myself start to enjoy it, I found it to be quite an amusing read. And I suppose I read it as if it was like a dark comedy, because I did find certain aspects of it quite amusing and some of the characters to be quite over the top and ridiculous. I'd say if you're someone who's tried to read this, or if you are planning to read it in the future, maybe kind of go into it with a bit of a light heart rather than reading it in a sort of super serious manner, because I think that's why I was having issues with it in the first place. Another book that I really loved this year was The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen. So this is actually a little short story collection. There are a few other short stories after you read The Great God Pan, but The Great God Pan was one of the creepiest, eeriest stories that I've read in quite some time. So it starts out with a doctor who's doing these scientific experiments on vulnerable people. He's purposely selecting people who he thinks won't be missed, and just taking advantage of them, whether they don't have much of a family and all that kind of thing. So you kind of get this like horrible seediness feeling from him. And his overall goal is to be able to make a person's mind open up to a spiritual plane, and he refers to this as seeing the Great God Pan. Then the story kind of follows a man who was aware of these experiments, and he comes across a young woman called Helen, who it seems to be that she is causing a lot of havoc in the town that she lives in. There's a lot of misfortune falling upon people who come into contact with her, and it just takes this sort of turn that you don't really expect. And I think there's definitely a huge aspect of like a thriller element to this story. I really couldn't stop reading it once I started it. I'm pretty sure it was actually in one of my reading vlogs earlier this year. but the way the story kind of twists and turns, it was really, really interesting, especially if you're into the occult, or at least stories about the occult. I definitely recommend this. It's just cool. Like, there's literally no other words for me to describe it. It's just cool, it's badass, and if you're into horror, you need to read it. Sticking with the horror theme, another book that I read in 2021 that I absolutely, like, devoured is Tinders the Flesh by Agustina Bastarrica. So this is a dystopian story. Everyone was talking about it in 2020 when this was translated into English. It was doing the rounds on Instagram a lot, and the American copy had a very interesting cover, and I just thought that seeing people's reactions to this, I was like, that's definitely one I'm going to have to pick up at some point. So I randomly got it at some point in 2021, and I ended up reading it in December. And this has to be the first solid binge read of 2021. And, you know, I took a while to get there, but like this, I really couldn't put down. Basically, what's happening in this dystopian future is that a virus has broken out amongst like every single animal on Earth. This causes the meat of any animals that humans consume to become poisonous, and it will ultimately kill the human. So as an alternative, instead of having the human race become vegans, they legalize cannibalism. And what happens is that there are these meat factories where humans are grown, but they're not referred to as humans because like that would be too weird, right? They're referred to as heads, which also kind of gave me the heebie-jeebies, to be perfectly honest. And we followed the character of Marcos, who is like a head honcho at the meat factory. And through him, we discover what is actually happening, and the story really unfolds. But he also has his own personal issues. Like, he is separated from his wife after they've had a really traumatic event, and he is just a kind of a shell of a human being after what's happened to him. So this book just gave me, again, I'm sorry to bring up food, but so much food for thought. I loved like the conspiracy theory aspects to this. I loved the desensitization of everyone in this, and how like just fucked up everyone is in this, basically. I liked how kind of graphic it got, because I think, you know, you wouldn't want to write about a topic like this and have it be kind of tame. The fact that the author had the balls to just really take you there and just go all the way was really impressive to me. And if you're into horror, if you're into dystopian, if you're into gore, I'd say you should really check this out, because again, like, it was an absolute binge read. And I'm sorry I didn't get to it sooner. Like, I'm sorry I didn't read it when there was all this hype about it at the time. But in the end, the fact that this was so hyped when it came out, and I still ended up really, really enjoying it, shows like what a great book and what great storytelling there is in this. Because, oh my god, like, I have so many thoughts on this. Like, I think I'm gonna have to do just like a standalone book review on this. Now, before I wrap this video up, I just want to talk about the non-fiction that I read over 2021, which was only 2 novels. The first being The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. So as you know, Joan Didion recently passed away, which was really sad news, but she is one of my all-time favourite authors, and this book in particular depicts her life after the loss of her husband, and it really is just about grief and learning to not necessarily cope with grief but live with it, and just the overall process of it. I feel like she depicts it incredibly well. And, you know, I read this at a time where I really needed to read it, because it was, even though I was reading about somebody else's grief and struggles in her life as well, because during this her daughter's also in hospital, and it just seemed like a very overwhelming experience for someone to be going through so much distress in one particular moment. But as I was reading it, I felt like it was very cathartic to me, because even though I was watching somebody else work through their own grief, it made me feel like I was able to work through my own in real time with her. I'd recommend this to anyone who has lost a loved one, who may be having a tough time coping with their feelings or just coping with the loss. I did say at the time when I read this that I think there are people who would read this and feel like it might be kind of talking down to them, or that it might be, you know, what's talked about in this might not sit well with them in some way, because I think, you know, grief is a very personal thing, and, you know, reading a book on it isn't really going to help you necessarily. But for me and my experience reading it, I felt like it really did me the world of good, and it was a very cathartic experience. And it's kind of one that I'm grateful to have had, you know, because there's times where you feel like you can't really speak about it, or a certain amount of time has passed and you can't keep bringing stuff up to people. But, you know, in your private inner world, being able to kind of deal with it in the sense of feeling like you're kind of with someone else in that moment kind of helps. I'm probably like describing that really, really badly, but I'm not great at talking about these sort of subject matters. But yeah, The Year of Magical Thinking definitely is now one of my all-time favourite books. And then finally, the last book that I regard as being one of the best books that I read in 2021 is The Year of the Monkey by Patti Smith. Now, if you followed my channel for a while or are familiar enough with my tastes, you'll know that Patti Smith, again, is one of my all-time, not just favourite authors, but favourite musicians, favourite people in the world in general. And I always regard her work as like being must reads for me, at least. And I feel like she is one of those authors who could write about anything and I would still be interested. Now, this depicts her life in 2016, and she didn't have a particularly great year in 2016. And it's very weird because in the end, in the epilogue, she refers to the coronavirus, which you're just like, ooh, Patti, if you only knew what was about to come. She is coping with her own issues within this, but she's also a very wanderlust type of person, and she does a lot of traveling, not just traveling because of her work, but traveling for herself. She's a very curious person, very inquisitive, and the fact that she just like sets out, I'd love to be able to live like that, even if it was only for a short while, and just go around and take photos of things and talk to people and be observant of the world. And I think that's why she's probably such a great artist, is because that's her nature. And her nature is to learn and to always grow. So within this, there's some anxieties that she shows about turning 70. And this is the year before she turns 70, where she doesn't really know what she's going to make of the coming year. But she reflects that anything can happen because, after all, it is the year of the monkey. Like I said, it doesn't seem like it is a necessarily wonderful, top-notch year, but she still writes about it in a way that is utterly compelling. And I feel like even though you might not be massively interested in some of the talking points in this, like there's a good aspect of kind of like political discussion with the state of America at the time and the world in general. But I find that even if she's talking about sort of like hot button topics or kind of stuff that you'd view as more everyday and dull sort of topics, reading her work for me has always just been like wrapping myself up in a warm blanket with a hot chocolate and getting cozy. It just makes me feel warm inside. So if you're going to read anything by Patti Smith, probably start with Just Kids. That's what people usually would start with. Just Kids is an absolutely fantastic novel. Especially if you're into the music scene of the 1970s. The Year of the Monkey did not disappoint. I thoroughly enjoyed it. So those were my best reads of 2021. I know last year when I did my end of year kind of wrap up video, I pretty much reviewed every 4 and 5 star book that I read last year, but I thought that was like far too much. I just wanted this year to focus mainly on the stuff that was most impactful to me and the stuff that I know is going to linger in my mind for quite some time. So let me know what the best books that you read in 2021. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I really cherished over the year. And I hope you really enjoyed this video, and I will talk to you soon. Goodbye.